Hello and welcome to the video guide for the Aristotle paper for ancient and medieval philosophy. So, quick recap of the stuff about the draft and how to turn it in. For the draft, you can do a draft, and they are submitted through Canvas, of course, and you can do drafts early before the due date, and you can do multiple drafts. You do as many as you wish, and of course you can wish to do none. The drafts are scored and commented on, but not graded. What that means is that I put a number on there that if you were to turn in that version of the paper as your final version, that would be the grade that you would get. But the draft itself does not count towards the final grade or against it. So the due date is a suggested date when you should probably do a draft by, but the important date is the available until date, and that's the final opportunity to submit a draft. And same rules as the draft due date. And the reason why I have a available until date is for obvious reasons that I would need time to look at your paper, comment on it, and you need at least some time to revise it. And so there has to be a deadline for drafts. Now, what about the actual final version of the paper? Well, somewhat perhaps needlessly complicated, there are three paper dates that you can turn the paper in on. You can turn them in, of course, before the dates, but there are three available until dates. And each of these has a good reason behind it, or perhaps it just seemed like a good idea at the time. So the first one, the on-time or +5 bonus deadline, the reason for that is extra credit. Every class I've ever taught, people have asked me, hey, is there extra credit? And yes, one form of extra credit in this class is the +5 bonus deadline. The way you get this extra credit is you submit your final version of the paper as a readable Word or PDF file and make sure it's the correct paper for the class. And Canvas, hopefully everyone knows by now, that Canvas can only read certain file types, at least the last time I checked, and so make sure it's something readable. Occasionally I get files that Canvas can't read, and then I just have to ask for a resubmission. I don't accept print or email copies. Everything has to go through Canvas because it's more convenient and easier, etc. And the extra credit is if you turn in your paper by that deadline, you would get +5 points added to your base score. Since this is extra credit, an extra thing, there's no extensions for this. So if you want that +5, you have to have the paper in, final version in by then. Now, maybe wondering what happens if something happens. What if a person gets sick or has a minor injury, or just needs more time or has other things to work on. In this case, I have the emergency deadline. So there's a second deadline because of potential emergencies. I've been teaching a long time, and people do get minor illnesses. They have other classes they need to work on. They have work, family, etc. Things that don't prevent them from doing the paper for an extended period of time, but may require a delay. And so rather than, rather than mess around with excuses and documentation and so forth, I created the emergency deadline. And that's a full credit deadline for unexpected, or perhaps even expected, issues. This requires no documentation, no permission. You can simply just use it. You just go turn your paper in for the emergency deadline, and as long as it's in before the available until date, then you'd get full credit. Now, same rules, of course. It's got to be on Canvas through the assignment. It's got to be a Word or PDF format that can be read by the Canvas system. Now, what if something really wrong goes wrong? For example, what if someone gets called up for National Guard duty and they're unable to get reliable Wi-Fi access, or just don't have the time to work on the class because they're being assigned to do various things? Or if someone is badly injured. Some years ago, a wall fell on a student and they came to class, with casts on both their arms, and they obviously couldn't work on the paper. So something, serious happens that would delay working the paper for an extended period of time. Let me know, and I'm happy to work with people. Now, what if someone misses the emergency deadline, but they don't have a good reason? Well, for this, I created the 50%, or sometimes call it the desperation deadline. And I created this when someone some years ago emailed me saying, hey, I forgot there's a paper in the class, but I'm a graduating senior, Is there anything I can do? And this was close to the last second. And then so I created the desperation or 50% deadline, which occurs when a person doesn't have any, admittedly like a good reason for not having done the paper on time, but still want to complete it at the last second, get some credit. And hence the 50% deadline. The paper can be turned in for partial credit, and after that, there would be no credit. It has to go in, of course, through Canvas and has to be readable, and check to make sure that it's the right paper, because once that deadline goes, that's literally the last second of the last chance. Typically, the 50% deadline is the last day of finals, 11:59 p.m. That way I could have a chance to grade papers on that Saturday, finalize my grades, and then turn them in on that Monday. So pretty much kind of like the last possible minute. Now, although there are 3 deadlines or available until dates for the paper, you only have to do the paper once. And this sometimes creates, again, perhaps it's needlessly complicated, perhaps I should change it, but this can create a bit of panic. For what usually happens is the +5 deadline rolls around, and I'll get a panicked email from a student saying, I get a 0 on the +5 paper deadline, but I didn't do a paper. Why do I have a 0 on it? And then I'll reply back, politely and reasonably that, this is working as intended, because if a person doesn't do a paper with a +5 deadline and it passes, that means there's a 0 there. Now, it doesn't mean, this is what people worry about, that they have suddenly failed the paper, because there's still the emergency deadline at that point, and of course the 50% deadline. So you only turn the paper in once. So if you do miss that +5 deadline, a 0 will go in. But if you turn a paper for the emergency deadline or the 50% deadline, that'll become the paper grade. And if you look on Canvas, you'll see there's a paper column that is the grade for the paper, but then there are 3 assignments under that: the +5, the emergency, and the 50%. And what those do is those are 3 assignments counting towards the paper grade, and only the best one counts. So you only turn the paper in once. What happens if you turn in 2 or 3? Well, in that case, it keeps the best one of those 3. So that's how to do the stuff for the paper for the deadlines. So now to the actual content of the paper. So this paper is about our good dead friend Aristotle, and the reading for it is Habit and Virtue. Not the entire thing, but the section of it dealing with the education on moral education is best undertaken by the state. And in the PDF paper guide, I have the full text to be summarized there, along with an outline. And I'll go over the outline in the course of this video. The thesis of the paper is this. The purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate Aristotle's case that education and goodness is best undertaken by the state. And the issue is this: is education and goodness best undertaken by the state? If you had classroom before, you might be familiar with the 4-part paper format that I always follow. All my papers are always 4 parts, and I stick with the same approach here. Part 1 is the introduction. This is 125 words or less because it's only worth 5 points. The current record for length of introduction is 6 pages. They did get the 5 points, but that's a lot of words for 5 points. This needs to contain the thesis, which you can just copy. The summary statement, that's where you say, I will summarize Aristotle's arguments about moral education. Your position statement, that position on the issue, what is your view on it? The argument statement is a concise, brief statement about how you're going to argue. You'll say, I will argue in support of Aristotle's view by however you're going to do it, or I'll argue against Aristotle's view, however you're going to do that. And then some minimal background to give the 5th point. And this can be, a sentence or 2, Aristotle was a student of Plato, wrote a bunch of stuff, died, still dead today. The summary should be at least 250 words. I don't grade by, word count as such. I wouldn't read a paper and say, oh my God, this is so brilliant, but they only have 249 words. Sadly, they do badly. Because a person could have a relatively short paper, and it could be really, really good. And a person could have an incredibly long paper, and it could be terrible. Every word could be terrible. Now, keep in mind, of course, Gordon rule requirements, etc., etc. So make sure you do hit that Gordon rule word count. So if your summary is too short, you have to kind of make it up in the argument section. But people like, to know what is the absolute minimum that can be done. It's worth 45 points. And the objective is to convey the key points there clearly, concisely, accurately, and in your own words. So in terms of the content, we'll be looking at Aristotle's argument from the Nicomachean Ethics that education and goodness is best undertaken by the state. His first argument is about the education of the youth, and he claims that obtaining a right training for goodness from early age is hard unless one has been brought up under the right laws. The reason for this, he claims, is because a temperate and hearty way of life is not pleasant to most people, especially when young. And as the song goes, kids just want to have fun. Because of this, he claims that upbringing and occupations were regulated by law, and the reasoning, why by law, and his reasoning is because they will cease to be irksome when they become habitual. And so his essential argument is that you've got to get the kids when they're young, because that way, once it's regulated by law, eventually people will find it less annoying once they become habituated. His second argument is regulation of life. And so this builds upon, the education of the youth. And he says it's not enough to have received this right upbringing and supervision in youth, that people must keep observing this regimen and accustoming themselves to it even after they're grown up, that this law and other laws will be needed to regulate activities and the entire life. So it's not enough that, for his reasoning, it's not enough that people be, raised kind of under this law to be habituated. This must continue. So even after they complete, become adults and complete their schooling, the law must keep regulating them. In terms of his reasoning, here's what he contends. He claims that most people are more likely to submit to compulsion and punishment rather than to arguments and fine ideals, that people are to be compelled by force. Now, he does say that some people think legislators, people who create, pass laws, should encourage people to goodness and appeal to their finer feelings in their hopes that their habits will respond, but also inflict chastisement, and penalties, basically punishments, and, saying, bad, here's some punishment, on any who disobey through deficiency of character, and to deport the incorrigible. Exile was not a super common thing, but it was a means of punishment in the city-states of the Greeks. And he claims that a good person whose life is related to a fine ideal will listen to reason. The bad person whose object is pleasure must be controlled by pain like a beast of burden, and the pains inflicted should be those most contrary to the favored pleasures. So the gist of his reasoning is that we can't simply, have the kids brought up properly. This has to regulate the entire, every life, from people are going to be regulated from, cradle to the grave. And the main reason here essentially is compulsive power, that most people will not do what is right just because it's right. They'll have to be compelled by punishment and pain. Finally, his third argument is the guidance argument. And he kind of recaps the previous two, that to be a good person, you have to be brought up in the right way and trained in the right habits. That ties back to the first argument about the education of the youth. And a person must spend the rest of their life in reputable occupations, doing no wrong either with or against one's will. So this must extend throughout the entire life. So how should this be done? Well, his reasoning is that this can be done by living under the guidance of some intelligence or right system that has effective force. So he sees this as requiring, these qualifications, that it's got to be, intelligent or right, and it has to have force. Now, what about having individuals do this? Like a person's father, for example. Well, he claims that individuals don't have any real forceful or compulsive power in general. They might have compulsive power, like in a particular case, unless that person is, a king or a ruler. And he claims that law, being the pronouncement of a kind of practical wisdom or intelligence, does have the power of compulsion. So he's claiming, two things here about law. Namely, it's a kind of practical wisdom or intelligence, although I must note, it doesn't go into detail here, but Aristotle does recognize there can be bad governments with very bad laws. So he's not claiming that all law is good. Good laws are good. He does claim that law does have the power of compulsion. So the law needs to have practical wisdom and also needs to have the power of compulsion behind it. And he claims, which you might dispute, that although people resent it when their impulses are opposed by human agents, even if they are in the right, the law causes no irritation by enjoining decent behavior. So, as he sees it, the law has those factors in its favor. That it would have, if the laws are, good laws, they'll have practical wisdom, and they'll have compulsive power, and then it'll be not annoying, or so he claims, or perhaps, less annoying. Now, he does consider cases where the state fails in its educational responsibilities. I mean, Aristotle wrote an entire book on politics and was aware, there's all kinds of different types of governments. He identifies like a huge range of governments and notes that, governments can be, bad governments with bad laws. And so if the state neglects this, he believes it can be supplied by the parents. But he puts a requirement on it that this would call for some knowledge of legislative science. Essentially, they would need to know what they're doing. The best solution, though, he thinks, is a proper system of public supervision of these matters. And if the state neglects this, he thinks that it would be right for each individual to help his children and friends on the way to goodness, and that he should have the power or at least the choice of doing this. But this is a difficult task. He notes that producing a right disposition in a person is not a task for anybody. If anyone can do it, it is the man with knowledge. And he draws an analogy because philosophers, especially Aristotle, love analogies. Just as in the case of medicine and all the professions that call for application and practical understanding. So if the state somehow fails in this, again, he thinks that parents or others could do this, but to do it properly, it would require knowledge. They have to know what they're doing. And his reason for this, again, is analogy to other professions, that if a person's going to be like, treating someone for illness, they would need to know medicine. Or if someone's doing, chemistry, they would need to know chemistry. So that's the content to be summarized. And the objective, again, is to clearly, concisely, and accurately, but in your own words, summarize what is going on there. Now, in terms of, looking at it in terms of like, how should this go? And how do I assess it? Well, and when you're writing it, you'd want to make sure you've got the key points from the text, that it's complete, but not like overly done. It's got to be concise as well. It also has to have, that's a concise thing. No fluff, should be the important things. Ideally, it'll be clear, that the writing is clear and easy to follow, well presented, well formatted. I always recommend people use paragraphs, not only because it's just so much easier to read paragraphs than to look at a wall of text. You can try this yourself, write, have something, no paragraphs, and then go to read, entire paper like that, read about 35 of those, or read something that's got paragraphs. Also, it's a very practical thing, according to studies. You want to check on this, see if it's actually true, but according to what I've read over the years, on standardized tests with essays, having paragraphs leads to better grades, and probably in part because the person reading it is less, annoyed by having to grind through a disorganized wall of text. So paragraphs, good. Next, accuracy. It needs to be accurate, and it should have organization. I've provided the outline there, so if you follow the organization, it will be well organized, or at least an organization that I can't be critical of because it's mine. If you do cite stuff, then you be sure to cite it properly. Ideally, it should be original. I mean, true, it's obviously a summary, and there's a good question like, how do I do an original summary? But the idea is to kind of convey it in your own words, your own voice. It should be relevant. People are often tempted, myself as well, to have commentary or critique and judge in the summary. But the objective of a summary is not to editorialize or critique or comment or judge, the object of a summary is simply say clearly, concisely, and accurately what is the content. The judgment and criticism comes in the argument section. I've got a rubric for this, so if you want to look at the rubric, like how, if you're wondering like how do I grade the thing in terms of the points, here's the rubric. An excellent one, clearly and concisely presents all the key points in your own words, clearly shows the connection between the key points, presents a summary as a coherent whole, clearly presents the arguments in the text and shows their structure in relation to the whole. It is extremely well organized, and paragraphs. A good one, of course, does what the excellent one does, but not quite as well. It's, has some flaws for being excellent. Adequate one gets the job done. It's adequate. It presents the points, is adequate or organized. It's adequate, but not good. A poor one has some flaws, but nothing fatal. And of course, a failing one has, ranging the most extreme, of course, would be just like nothing or completely on a totally different topic, nothing to do with Aristotle, or has other major flaws. And kind of oddly, perhaps, it has the biggest point range. So you'd want to, even if a summary is like a failing one, it could still have a fair amount of points that would make a difference in the grade. So that's the summary. Part 3 is the argument part. And you'll want to label the sections of the paper, introduction, summary, and argument, and conclusion, to help organize like what you're doing, to make sure, okay, I'm going to do this in the introduction, this in the summary, this in the argument, this in the conclusion. And when I grade it based on, does the paper do those things? So I look for, where you have put your introduction, summary, and argument. And sometimes people leave it off, and I can find it. Sometimes, though, especially papers that are generated with AI, I can't tell. I can't. There's no distinction. It's just a big wall of text. Everything kind of smushed together. Again, especially AI papers. That's often how I find them, because they don't do the assignment properly. And again, as I mentioned in class, I don't fail people for using AI because it's difficult to determine exactly how it's done, that it's being used. I would fail it based if the content is failable. Grade on merit, essentially. So, part 3, argument. So the objective here, the argument is 250 words plus. Again, you got to hit the word count, etc., for Gordon rule, blah, blah, blah. And of course, you have to have a certain number of words to complete the assignment adequately. It's worth 45 points. And you'll want to begin by stating your position on the overall issue. Is education and goodness best undertaken by the state? And you can select a context, like a time and place. Like kind of likely and reasonable thing to do would be to say, is Aristotle still relevant today? Do his arguments, do they hold up now, or do they fail now? So here are some options. You don't have to do all of these because they're options. So one option is doing a direct defense of Aristotle. So if you agree with Aristotle and want to defend his actual arguments, this would be the option to take. Like if you say, oh, Aristotle's right, I like his arguments. So you want to support all 3 of his main arguments using your own reasons. So since arguments, always work like arguments, what matters are the, premises and the logic. You would do the following. First thing to do is premise support. Argue that each key premise is plausible and show the overall reasoning is, it's good reasoning, that he's reasoning well. Technically, it wouldn't be sound because it's not deductive, but, informal usage. Also, for argument support, what you could do is a direct defense by providing new arguments that reinforce each of Aristotle's 3 arguments. For example, you could use an analogy between moral education and math or science education. And then, of course, you conclude, the state should be the moral educator just as it teaches academic subjects, for example. Now, you could do both in the same paper. You could defend, Aristotle's arguments directly, why they're good, and then argue why his arguments, argue for his arguments. And that'd be a direct defense of Aristotle. Again, if you say, hey, Aristotle's right, and I want to defend his actual arguments, that's the option to pick. Option 2 is critiquing Aristotle's case. Choose this option if you disagree with Aristotle and want to challenge his actual arguments. Your task is to undercut each of his 3 main arguments using your own reasoning. and here's how to attack him. One option, of course, again, because arguments generically are assessed in terms of the quality of the premises and the quality of the reasoning. And the argument basics videos go over how this works, how it's done. So going after premises, you'd want to argue, the key premises are implausible or flawed. For example, Aristotle claims in his third argument that people don't find, obeying the law irritating. But I'm willing to bet you could probably easily show that people can find the law, irritating. But of course, one could argue against that even though people do find the law irritating, they still often go along with it. And I intentionally picked, this case because you can reasonably argue either way. That you could argue that people, go along with the law, even though they might find it irritating, or you could argue that people do find it irritating to a degree that, if the state was imposing too much on, say, morality, people would find it too annoying and perhaps not comply. Also critical is the reasoning. So in this case, it's not disputing whether the particular premises are plausible. It's going after the reasoning itself, that the logic is somehow, flawed, and that the reasoning, fails. One way to do this is to point out that the premises are flawed, so that undermines the logic of the argument. Bad premises. Even if you put bad premises into good reasoning, then the argument still fails. For trying and establishing its claim. Or you could go after the reasoning itself. And of course, you could use things like evidence, examples, and, arguments, etc. To do this. And depending on how you approach it, you would use different techniques. And if you're not sure what to do, ask me, good idea. And you can, of course, do a draft, and if you do a draft, I'll put comments on it in particular. A third option is if you agree with Aristotle's conclusion, but want to support it with your own arguments. So your task would be here to argue that moral education is best undertaken by the state, but you're not relying on Aristotle's three original arguments. Essentially, you're agreeing with him, and you're defending your position in the following way. You provide new reasons supporting state-led moral education. And you could use, one option might be using analogies or examples to make your case. For example, traffic law analogy. You could contend that just as uniformity is needed in traffic laws, moral education requires centralized guidance. You could also use language analogy. State-based language education parallels the need for consistent moral instruction. And of course, you want, hopefully, ideally, to be like original. But again, Aristotle has been talked about for thousands of years. Education been talked about for thousands of years. So there's only so many ways to be like kind of original. But ideally, it should be, of course, clear and philosophical. Finally, fourth option. You could challenge Aristotle's claim with new arguments. So choose this option if you disagree with Aristotle, but you want to offer your own reasons against state-led moral education. So your task here is to argue that the state should not be the moral educator, but your objective is not to critique his three original arguments. Your goal is to provide, reasons why this shouldn't be the case. So some possible ways to attack the idea that the state should be a moral educator. One option is arguing for moral autonomy, which is that imposing a single morality through the power of the state could itself ironically be immoral. And of course, there are also practical concerns. Who will fund moral education? Which morality gets chosen? How will this all work? And then, of course, tie it into the issue. You could also use, sort of perhaps ironically, the knowledge critique. You could use Aristotle's own standard, namely that moral educators must have proper knowledge, and you might ask, if you want to put it in a modern context, do modern politicians possess sufficient moral wisdom? Are they capable of providing moral guidance? And if the answer is no, in a sense by Aristotle's own standard about the moral educator must have this knowledge, sort of ironically, it would undercut that argument. And Aristotle might agree with that. If the politicians were, too unwise and wicked to engage in moral education, they probably shouldn't be doing that. And be sure to tie all arguments that you create to the central issue, which is the state the best agent for moral education? So how does the argument section get assessed? Well, Completeness, of course, your position, all the key issues, clarity, of course, presentation, good organization. If you do any quotes, cite them properly. Original is possible. Again, we've been talking about Aristotle for thousands of years, so there's only so much can be said. So it's not. It'd be amazing if someone came up with something like brand new, completely original. But again, I have reasonable expectations for how original someone can be on a subject that's thousands of years old. It should, of course, be relevant. Everything in there should connect to the issue. And the main thing is the quality of the argument. Premises need to be plausible, and the reasoning needs to be good reasoning. I also, of course, have a rubric for this. The excellent argument section is clearly and concisely presents your position on the issue, prevents effective and well-developed arguments, presents the argument section of the work as a coherent whole, clearly presents how the arguments impact on the overall issue, and is extremely well organized. Good one does most of what the excellent one does, but it's got some flaws, so it's not excellent. An adequate one gets the job done. It's adequate. A poor argument section has some flaws, but not fatal. And then the one that's a failing argument has some fatal flaws. The most fatal, of course, is turning in nothing. So that's the argument and the argument rubric. Lastly is the conclusion. It's worth 5 points. Should be 125 words or less. There's no penalty for going over, but it's the more you write in your conclusion for those 5 points, you're spending a lot of effort for little return. It should include the following 5 points. And as a pro tip, you can copy paste from the introduction to the conclusion, changing just 2 things. One is you might want to change the tense. Instead of saying I will summarize, you'd say I summarized. And the minimal background would be replaced by a final remark because you've already given the background. So you'd say, I summarized my position is, or you could say my position was, either's fine. And you'd say I argued that, and then your final remark, like even though Aristotle's dead, his approach to moral education still manifests in today's system of education, in which the state is, imposing moral values upon us, or whatever your final remark might be. And that is the end of the paper for Aristotle. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.